Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 3. Oh yeah, it's all coming together. As he expected, Izuku got very little sleep that night. It didn't get too cold, but every creak and breeze had him bracing for impact, and it definitely wasn't comfortable huddling in on himself on top of hard concrete for hours at a time. When the sun broke through the holes in the wall that used to be windows, he decided to call it quits on trying to sleep. He dragged himself into a sitting position and listened with mild horror as bones he didn't know he had popped and creaked. He did a round of stretches, and luckily his young bones recovered quickly from their night of abuse. For all the noises he did hear last night, people were not one of them. There were definitely some critters poking around, but nothing big enough that their footsteps could have been a person. Glancing at his phone, the time read 5:13 a.m., and the battery read 18%. Wonderful. He knew one of his hidey holes at school had an outlet where he'd charge his phone before, but the gates didn't open until 7 anyway. So there was no use leaving now. Brushing the dust and dirt off, he decided to explore. The place was much easier to navigate in the full light of day. There was a taller building to the west, so the building was already shaded yesterday evening when he arrived. From the looks of it, the place appears to have been a brick factory, one that has been abandoned for a very long time. Likely the factory full of workers was eventually made obsolete by a handful of people with material manipulation quirks. Izuku remembered reading somewhere that before the age of quirks, people were worried that everyone's jobs would be taken by robots. They weren't wrong, but it seems silly now that the entire support industry devoted to making gadgets capable of what people with quirks could do. The building had likely been out of use for almost a century, and it looked it too. There were patches between support beams where the roof had caved in, and to Izuku's horror, so had the floor. He'd been on top of a sub-level this whole time, not on solid ground. He'd have to find the stairs, as they were generally made to be the most stable part of the building in case of collapse and evacuation. Skirting around the outer wall and far from the crumbling holes in the center, he eventually found a set of stairs which, as he suspected, would be in perfect condition if not for the layers of dirt and dust that lay undisturbed. Further proof that no one was lurking around the place. However, he would not be going down there without a flashlight. No way in hell. He couldn't see past the first 5 steps. It's not that he was scared of the dark. It's just that this place was not somewhere he fancied stumbling around blindly. That wouldn't lead to anything good. He checked his phone again. 5:45, 16%. He needed to find some way to charge his phone. The hour he had between the gates opening and class starting wouldn't be enough for a full charge. What was open this early? A cafe? The library, maybe? A quick search on his phone told him that the library opens at 6:30, and a cafe not far from school was already open, likely catering to early morning commuters. He decided that if the library was open when he got there, then that's where he would go. If not, he'd see how long he could get away with loitering in the cafe without buying anything. They were both in the same direction, so after checking everything was in his bag for the 10th time that morning, he headed out. The streets were far more barren than he was used to. It made sense. 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. wasn't the most preferred time to be awake, and the unemployed and homeless population in this area was high, so not many people had a reason to be up this early. He made his way uninterrupted through and out of the district and into the next, which was much more lively. The scene changed abruptly from one block to the next. It's like he walked out of a ghost town. Luckily, he didn't have to walk through busy streets for long. He could see the library a few blocks down, so he ducked his head and charged forward. He made it there only 12 minutes before they opened, so he figured he'd just wait. He plopped down on the ground and leaned against the wall as time passed. Only about 5 minutes later, a woman with dark hair that shone iridescent purple in the light came to open the door and let him in. Izuku scrambled to his feet as she beckoned him in. You don't have to open early for me. I can wait out here. It's not a problem, kid. Hardly anyone ever comes in this early. It's not like I'm letting in a horde of angry customers. You seem harmless enough to be around for... She checked her watch. 4.5 minutes without getting paid, she said with a sarcastic smirk. With a quick bow, he darted his way through the door she'd been holding open for him. Thank you. Shinso Kahaku. Yes, thank you, Shinso-san, he said with another bow. It's no problem, kid. Did you need my help with anything? She said, stifling a laugh about how obnoxiously polite the kid was. It was cute. No, sorry for bothering you, he said, barely stopping himself from bowing a third time as he scuttled off toward the computer. He stopped in his tracks when he rounded the corner to see a kid that appeared to be around his age already sitting at one of the computers. He had a plume of purple hair that stuck up at odd ends, and he hadn't seemed to notice Izuku yet. He didn't know this kid, so it was unlikely this kid knew of him. There was no reason to freak out like this, he rationalized. Quietly, he made his way to the computer furthest from the other kid while still keeping him in his line of sight, just in case. He plugged in his phone and laptop, mentally hitting himself for not remembering that he could have been charging his phone from his laptop this whole time. Whatever. That didn't matter now. He booted up the library computer to make it look like he came here for another reason than to leech their electricity. He spent some time researching how much he could sell the pieces of his hero merch he could remember off the top of his head, and it looked like each piece could sell for anywhere between 3,000 yen to 20,000 yen. Hopefully that wasn't a scam. He'd have to keep an eye on that particular piece to see if it actually sold for that much. After a while, he decided he should probably try to sort through his miserable attempt at his homework while he had the chance to look things up. The English needed some corrections. Kami, he was out of it last night, but everything else wasn't too bad. His best effort last night is the level he'd usually dumb himself down to in order to avoid the teachers accusing him of cheating. So he left it as is. He was nearly fluent in English, though. He did his best to teach himself after Hisashi moved to America, hoping to be able to visit with Mama so that she would be happy. It was a pipe dream, but he was leagues ahead of his peers in English now, so it wasn't for nothing. He packed away his things and glanced at the time. 7:17. He should make his way to school, lest he have a repeat of yesterday morning. As he slung his bag across his shoulders, he glanced up at the kid who'd been sitting there when he walked in, only to find him already looking at Izuku. Cracking the most awkward smile he could have possibly mustered, he waved at the boy quickly before turning on his heel and marching off as fast as he could without tripping over his own feet. Kami, he was so socially inept. It went right past funny and straight to just sad. The first half of the school day passed with the usual amount of fanfare, but when the lunch bell rang, Izuku knew that was going to change. He hadn't eaten in over 24 hours at this point. He'd packed as many non-perishables as he could, but he'd yet to touch them as most of it was bundled up in his clothes at the beach. Izuku had grown accustomed to not eating for long stretches of time. The pang of hunger was familiar and easily ignored, but the shake of his hands was not. He was getting clumsy from the low blood sugar, and uncooperative limbs didn't make for an easy escape. He'd usually spend his lunch break on the roof to avoid the crowds. He had a few granola bars. He could eat those on the roof and be fine, but he'd need to go to the lunchroom eventually. He was homeless, with no income, and it was free food. He wouldn't have a choice for much longer. Deciding it was better to rip the Band-Aid off, he followed the swarm of his peers to the lunchroom. Worst comes to worst, his lunch ends up on the floor and he's stuck eating his granola bars, like he was going to anyway. He took his place in line with some of the students he didn't recognize. Hopefully they wouldn't recognize him either. He kept his head down as he made his way through the line. He got his food without issue. Now he just needed to make a clean break. Sticking close to the lunch monitors and custodians made it less likely for someone to outright slap his tray out of his hand. Crash! Izuku hit the ground as someone tripped him from behind. Oh, my bad. Deku, I didn't see you there. You're so little I must have walked right into you, he said as his group of cronies giggled at the table nearby. He wasn't wrong. The boy was a good head taller than him. It could have easily been an accident, but he could tell by the amused expression on the boy's face that it wasn't. The boy turned on his heel, not bothering to help Izuku up or clean up the mess he'd made. Both, luckily and not so luckily, Izuku fell chest first onto his tray, so most of the food was still on it. Unfortunately, the majority of what wasn't still on the tray was now covering his chest. On the bright side, that meant he had very little to clean off the floor. With a fistful of napkins, he whipped up the mess on the floor and grabbed his tray before any more disasters could befall it. He ate his lunch in a single-stall bathroom on the other side of the school as he attempted to get food off his thankfully black Gakurin. The end of lunch break found him back in class with a very wet, mostly clean jacket and a belly full, so it could have been worse. He'd need to find more reliable methods of escaping the cafeteria in the future. When school let out for the day, Izuku milled around, taking several turns that looped in on themselves on heavily populated streets to make sure anyone who may have been following him would get bored of it before he anxiously headed to the beach. Approaching the beach, he noted several shifts in the scenery that worried him greatly. He tried to tell himself his spot was fine, and these changes were just new trash people had left. The explanation made sense. It was closest to what could be called the entrance to the beach, where people were more likely to dump things and make a quick getaway. However, no amount of rationalization was going to calm him down. Nothing but the sight of his stuff still intact would calm him down at this point. He's glad he took note of every little detail of this place, because he's not sure most people could have made it back to his stash without a very precise map. Maybe even a physical map. This place was a maze. He made as much of a beeline for the fridge as he could without actually being a bee. The surrounding mounds had thankfully not buried all his things, and upon opening the freezer, he was glad to see it all still there. It looks like the flimsy tub he hid his bag under had blown away. He really should have weighed it down, but thankfully the bag was still there. He set the duffel bag on top of the suitcase and threaded their handles together like he had the first time. And now came the interesting challenge of making his way through the rough part of town as a 12-year-old boy with 2 bags of luggage, one partially full of expensive collectibles, and a backpack full of electronics without getting into any trouble. Should he go now with everything while the sun was still up? Or should he take trips and risk being out too late? No, he should probably leave something here and come back for it tomorrow. That was the safest bet. Sighing, he stuffed the duffel bag into the freezer and shut it. As much as he'd like to have the peace of mind of knowing all his stuff was in his home-like place, he also very much would like not being mugged of all his earthly possessions in one fell swoop. Backpack and suitcase on hand, He made his way across town to Block 15 as quickly as he could, without looking more suspicious than he already did. He made eye contact with no one and forwent his usual waves and smile in order to keep a low profile. He kept his head down, but he was on high alert, making sure no one was following him. A man followed him for a block or two, but eventually let him be, hopefully deciding he had enough of a moral compass to not mug a child. It felt like he didn't breathe at all until he'd finally hidden himself in his own home sweet derelict abandoned building. He set his suitcase in the alcove that marked the opening to the stairs and dragged himself and his backpack over to a nearby hole in the wall window to work on his homework. When he completed that, he rewarded himself with a granola bar, packed all his things into his bag, and strapped it to his chest, curling around it like he had the previous night. Tonight, however, he wrapped himself up in his blanket and used his suitcase as a pillow.